536 was called like the worst year on record. It had 18 months of darkness. It was followed by like a mini ice age, followed by the bubonic plague, famine, wars. What people say is that during this time, the Roman Empire collapsed, and this began the Dark Ages. This sounds like the bowls of wrath. This sounds like trumpets. This sounds like the four horsemen of the apocalypse. It sounds like all those things. We're told that Jesus was in the first century. The destruction of Jerusalem was in 70 AD. I can imagine a lot of people, skeptical people who would be rightfully skeptical, they would say, well, that's interesting, but without it being closer to the times of Jesus, it seems like, well, that does sound kind of like it, but I don't buy it because it's not close enough. That was one of the said collapses of civilization in Europe, but it was one of three. Early antiquity collapse, there's a mid-antiquity collapse, and then you have a late antiquity collapse. The Western Roman Empire falls in early antiquity. Later, the mid-antiquity, you had a collapse on the eastern side. So the Eastern Roman Empire fell in mid-antiquity. And then late antiquity, the northern Europe collapsed. During the 536 timeline, it's said that the Mayan civilization collapsed at the same time. Now, historians mention that it could be volcanoes, it could be comets or meteors, but I mean, they really don't know when you actually really look into it. There's just no way that you could have this far-reaching collapse all the way to the Americas and it not affect the rest of Europe. Based on stratigraphy, there was no advancement in architecture, culture, art, and language. All the buildings are all at the same level of strata. The collapse in early antiquity, mid-antiquity, and late antiquity was all the same collapse. You take out 700 years, you put them all at the same level. This is when the world basically collapsed. 536, this was right after Jesus.
We'd like to welcome you back to another episode of Question the Narrative. And my co-host today is not able to be with us because he is having some tooth issues. So if you guys can please keep him in your prayers for him to have some relief and for him to heal up quickly, he'd much appreciate that. But once again, we got JT on the podcast, and we're going to talk about some stuff about the timeline of things that he's been looking into. And it's some very, very compelling information, guys. And it definitely supports what we've been trying to tell you guys about the little season, about the timeline being messed up. So this is going to be a banger, guys. So just glad you can join us. And what's up, JT? How you doing?
I'm doing well, my friend. How are you?
I'm doing well. It's good to have you back on the show, bro. It's always a pleasure. And I know last time we had you on, it was an awesome discussion. Honestly, I had told you it was immediately one of the most popular episodes that we had, and it just shot up the quickest out of any other episode. So I think that they really love that discussion about us just talking about the underground buildings and the cities, and then we got into a little bit of cryptids and stuff. It was just an amazing discussion, bro. But we wanted to have you back on to finish our discussion because we couldn't quite get into everything the last time.
Yeah, I think we kind of teased that we were going to do some meltology talk, and I think what's really cool is basically what I learned since then. So I think we can touch on the meltology a little bit, but what I found super interesting in the meantime is somebody sent me a YouTube video of this German researcher, professor, economist, sociologist, all those things. And he did a presentation about 700 years was added to the first millennia AD. And so, like you said, this was one of those things where like we understand the timeline has been manipulated in some kind of way. This guy gave us lots of receipts, lots of physical evidence. And what's really interesting is one of the most compelling parts of it to me, the whole thing I find just like mind blowing, but he shows depictions of Rome in like the 1600s just covered in mud. And so like with this idea, it's almost like that we've really questioned, like, so how did this stuff get buried? The underground stuff. It's like, this is an answer to that. And so obviously as however you want to go into this, it's kind of like, it's pretty in depth. And we did a podcast with my buddy, Paul from Understanding Conspiracy, and we broke down this presentation as best we could. And I broke it into 3 parts on my channel. The full presentation is over at Paul on Understanding Conspiracy's channel. But yeah, so let's go at your pace, however you want to do this, and we'll get right into it.
Yeah, so I actually listened to those those 3 episodes, and it was truly mind-blowing in my opinion, just because these characters, and we'll get into certain characters that might have been alive actually before Jesus, and yet we in our timeline in history are told that, oh, those people were after him. And so I thought that was pretty compelling too. And I don't know if you want to do some name drops on some of those that you
Well,
found
okay,
out.
we'll just get right into just
Yeah.
the general gist of the presentation. It was just that so Vitaly and I did a podcast over the summertime, and we were calling 536. I mean, you guys can look into this. 536 was called like the worst year on record based on historians and all this kind of stuff. And it it had 18 months of darkness that was followed by like a mini ice age, followed by the bubonic plague. And obviously, ice age, you're going to have a famine during these same times. You're having wars and everything. And so what people say is that during this time, the Roman Empire collapsed, and this kind of began the Dark Ages. And of course, in the podcast, me and Vitaly are saying, "Well, like this sounds like the bowls of wrath. This sounds like the trumpets. This sounds like the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. It sounds like all those things." But the year is 536. So if we're told that Jesus was in the first century, the destruction of Jerusalem was in the 70 AD. Okay, so that I can imagine a lot of people, skeptical people who would be rightfully skeptical. They would say, "Well, that's interesting, but without it being closer to the times of Jesus, it seems like, well, that does sound kind of like it, but I don't buy it because it's not close enough." Now, what's really interesting is what Gunnar Heinsohn does with this idea is that was one of the said collapses of civilization in Europe, but it was one of 3 in the first millennium. So basically, the 80 chronology from year 1 to 1000, there was a early antiquity collapse, probably around 2 or 300 AD, they say, and then there's a mid antiquity collapse around 5 to 600 AD, and then you have a late antiquity collapse. Now, what was really interesting about it was like so, the Western Roman Empire falls in early antiquity, and then but it's like if he was showing on a map and you could see these breakdowns of when civilization just basically collapsed in a certain area. And then later, the mid antiquity, you had a collapse on the eastern side. So the Eastern Roman Empire fell in mid antiquity. And then late antiquity, the northern Europe portion of Europe collapsed. And so Gunnar Heinsohn was saying, and he especially was talking about like that during the 536 timeline, it's said that the Mayan civilization collapsed at the same time. And so obviously it was based on some kind of cataclysm. Now, historians mention that it could be volcanoes, it could be comets or meteors, but I mean, they really don't know when you actually really look into it. They're speculating. And so Gunnar Heinsohn was saying that there's just no way that you could have this far-reaching collapse all the way to the Americas and it not affect the rest of Europe. And so what he concluded based on stratigraphy, and so that's obviously the study of like digging in the strata. So like if you have older civilizations and people built on those cities, you would have layers of the older things. And you can see that in like cities like Jerusalem. But what he was saying is that during the first millennium AD, there was no advancement in architecture, culture, art, and language. And then you'd be saying, but in the strata, all the buildings are all at the same level of strata. So what he concluded was that the collapse in early antiquity, mid antiquity, and late antiquity was all the same collapse. And they were just separated on the timeline. So what he did was he said the only thing that makes sense, if you take out 700 years, you put these things all at the same level instead of like chronologically up and down, you put them all at the same level. Then this is when Rome fell. This is when the world basically collapsed. And that to me was like, okay, so now what we're saying is like, so that mid antiquity collapse that I was saying about like 536, what he was basically saying, this was right after Jesus. And now we're like, Oh man.
Yeah. Yeah, that's so mind-blowing because, they're like you said, they're trying to put it in these like layers or levels of collapse, and what he's saying actually is that no, there was a single event possibly around the world, and it all happened at one time. It all happened at the same time, and that really gives a lot of credence to what we're trying to say. If Jesus came back, the destruction of the temple and the fall of Rome and the harlot and the beast and all that, like it makes sense, and it does say even in Revelation that the beast burns the harlot with fire, and that's
Mm-hmm.
what Rome did to Jerusalem. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
they burned the city down. And honestly, like I was, so I know that we had talked about this before too, but about like the mother of harlot and who is that. But if you really look in the Bible, the Lord refers to Jerusalem as like the harlot so many times because they were unfaithful to
Mm-hmm.
God so many times. They went and served other gods, and He delivered them to their enemies so many times. And then eventually they started crying back out to Him, and then He would save them. But He was constantly calling them a harlot because they were always serving other gods. And
Mm-hmm.
so, I mean, that's kind of, I know that you have been saying that about Jerusalem being the harlot, and I
Mm-hmm.
had told you in the past, I'm like, well, that's probably Rome, but I mean, really, I think now it kind of makes more sense that Rome was that beast. It was that fourth kingdom
Mm-hmm.
that was more. I think it says more diverse than the rest. It had a worldwide reach, and I think you were talking about in that last podcast or about that the timeline with Gunnar is that this Roman stuff, architecture, it's worldwide. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
their reach went far and wide. They were under control of everything. I mean, even the wasn't it Pontius Pilate? He was a Roman governor, right?
Yeah.
But he
Mm-hmm.
was in charge of Jerusalem too, and he was over them. So I mean, they even had Roman leader over Jerusalem as well. I mean, they delegated their power in such a way to where they were still in charge of separate parts of the world.
Yeah. Well, I think that that's the thing. It was really mind blowing is to think like that. So the way that Gunnar kind of presented things, he's not dating things backwards. He's dating things forward. Because if you take the 700 years out, we know that obviously the year would be wrong, but he's basically saying like the times of Jesus were like in the 800 range. And so you think about it, like the times of Jesus were obviously, if you read the nativity story, the Roman emperor at the time was Caesar Augustus. So we're said he's the first Roman emperor. And so what's really crazy is to think that like so in the heyday of Rome, it was really only like 1,000 years ago. Okay, so that's the wild thing. So now when you think about like that, I always had trouble when people would try to say like that maybe those buildings like could be Roman because like the buildings in America, I'd be like, oh well, are they really 2,000 years old? I don't know. I mean, I guess I couldn't really say, but 1,000 years old, I can buy that in a second. Especially you have these
Yeah.
places they don't have bathrooms and stuff like that. There's real oddities on the way they're built. Yeah, 1,000 years old kind of makes sense, and it's always kind of made sense to me that it seems more likely that there was some connection with Rome to North America and South America because of the architecture. It's like this idea that people built stuff in a Renaissance style because they admired Rome. But it's like, how would you admire Rome if you really didn't know Rome? Right? It's kind of like it's kind of a weird thing to think like that people would idolize Rome when the world was mostly a Christianized world, right? Because we would think Rome is bad, right?
Yeah.
Like, so you wouldn't try to emulate this pagan culture. Maybe that pagan culture lasted over because those buildings were literally from the Roman Empire. Now, I know that's crazy, but I mean, I think that we're taught that history progressed in this certain kind of way, 1492 and all this kind of stuff. But what this kind of research kind of shows you is that the Roman Empire was very advanced. And again, like the evidence is the buildings. And there's more evidence than just that. It's obviously Roman concrete, Roman glass, all kinds of things they did that the Europeans could not replicate afterwards. So could they sail across the seas? For sure. I mean, again, if you think about like what Gunnar Heinsohn potentially describes, we don't know how much it altered just the geography and topography of everything too. So like maybe the seas were not like they were. Maybe there was different islands and lands in between. And I'm not going to go as far to say that it was Pangea. I know some people have that idea. I don't know. The point is everything could have been different. And to me, the evidence is the architecture. I think that's a smoking gun. It's a smoking gun in the same way that pyramids on every continent is a smoking gun, that there was a civilization before. And then the Greco-Roman style is evidence that there was this other empire that was the most recent one.
Yeah, and it doesn't make sense that, across these borders that they all had the same type of building architecture, right? I think that Gunnar was talking about that too, and it makes more sense that they had this control over everyone else, and so that's why all their building structures are very similar.
Oh, definitely. So what I should make note of is that, like I was saying, so you have this pagan empire that eventually is copied, supposedly based on what history says. But what I found really interesting was Gunnar's takes based on Christianity. So Gunnar was not a Christian. He never proclaimed to be a Christian. And his goal was definitely not to prove guys like us right about something. He literally was. He's got this German guy. He's obviously probably got a super analytical mind, and he literally was just following the clues in the science, and this is the conclusions he came to. What he was basically saying was that Christianity is an anomaly, that Christianity is the only major religion in the whole world that did not have any buildings, any churches, any temples for the first 300 years of its existence. And when they first found churches, the very first churches from, like, I guess you'd say like the 300 AD range, they were built in what he called a Renaissance style. So that meaning they were built in the same style as the first century Roman basilicas. So they would be more like pagan buildings. And he said, but obviously, once again, these buildings were not built on top of anything. They were built at the exact same level of the strata as everything else. And that's the interesting thing, is I am friends with, obviously I'm friends with Paul and Alpha Talks over on Instagram. And I always send them articles of them always digging in the ground and, hey, whoops, we discovered Roman stuff. But the interesting thing is they never discover things under the Roman stuff. It's like that sediment covered all the Roman things, but there's nothing under it. So again, you have this one strata, and that's the strata that basically is all throughout Europe, all throughout the Middle East, all throughout all the places.
And you were saying a lot of that is, you said like a lot of that is buried about 15 meters or so. Is that what they were saying?
Up to 15 meters, so 45 feet under the ground.
Yeah, that's insane. To have that much buildup.
Yeah, and so what was interesting, I was discussing this with Paul on our live, and I was saying, I think it's unusual for things to be buried that deeply. You know what I mean? Like, you really have to think in your mind. I mean, of course, as Christians, we believe the Bible, so we have a certain kind of understanding of what could do that, what could bury a whole city. So I said, based on what I know in the Bible, the two things that could bury buildings would be the flood of Noah, and then also whatever this event was, which again potentially was the book of Revelation playing out. And so what I found really interesting, once again, this guy's not trying to prove me right, but I found a clip of him on the podcast where he was literally discussing that there was this sedimentary layer, and he's saying there's two main, I guess he called them infills of sediment in the stratigraphy. And one of them, he was saying that researchers date the one about 10,000 BC. And he says he doesn't really get into the dates because he says he's not going to just argue with that. But what he concludes is that one was from the deluge. So literally the accepted idea that there was a worldwide flood. So this caused a certain sedimentary layer. And then there's a layer above that. And there's only two. And so like he said that sometimes the science would try to separate the two, but he says there's really only two. And then so you have Noah's flood, and then you have whatever this was. To me, it's like, what else is there? I mean, what else
Right.
what else could it be? Because again, like it's absolutely a travesty that the mainstream does not even try to address the fact that there's all this buried stuff. They don't even mention it.
Yeah, they don't even entertain the idea that it could even be a possibility. And I know that we were talking about this, but I remember going to school. History was the worst subject for me. It was so boring, and they do that intentionally because it's like, well, who cares about all that stuff in the past, you know? But if people knew their true history and what really happened, it's actually fascinating and it's amazing information to know. But I mean, if you want to deceive someone, I mean, give them a false history. You know what I'm saying? You don't know where you've been. Now you don't know where you're going. You don't know anything.
Well, right. That's a lot of people who obviously concluded that we're in the little season. We've all had to wrestle with that idea from Revelation 20. It's like, so how would the devil deceive everyone? And so we concluded that he would have to confuse people where they are and when they are. And so that happened. Like I said, I feel like with solid evidence, we can finally say this is when this happened. And this is why people really don't know. Now, what I found interesting, and I tend to agree with Gunnar to a large extent, that the majority of the timeline funny business was not like, it's not like that everybody in universities know the true history and they're intentionally trying to deceive people. What his conclusion was, and again, this was what, like, when I first listened to this, it was like the jaw dropper, was when he's saying the reason that the people started to use the AD chronology was based on the book of Revelation. He said that people lived past whatever this apocalypse was, and they concluded that this must have been after the times of Jesus and potentially was after the 1,000 years. And so like they literally start to date things backwards to when Jesus was around. And I was like, that makes so much sense to me. It makes perfect sense to me because I said, I've never really understood how you could have a linear progression of time. You know, like literally you could date things back to when God said, let there be light, Anno Lumini. But one day they said, let's start changing the dates. Let's put a divider line in the chronology and we'll put when Jesus was here, and then we'll date things backwards, BC, and then afterwards we'll date it like this. Because if you had an unbroken timeline, even as a Christian, I would never suggest that. You know what I mean? We'd just be, okay, so this is when Jesus came. But it makes more sense if they did that because they did not know when they lived. They only knew they lived after the times of Jesus. And so then later, what his conclusion was, he says his first instinct is not to attribute malice or, ill intent to messing up the timeline. What he says is that he believed that they spaced out this timeline because they didn't know. And it was only later that historians tried to fill in the history of this millennia. I think the thing is that makes sense to me is the fact that when you listen to professors, you listen to scientists, you listen to academics, they present lots of theories as if they are facts. And if you didn't know, you would just, oh, well, that's already been settled, right? Like kind of like the theories of gravity, the theory of evolution, the Big Bang, and all that stuff. They talk about it like it's a fact. But then you realize, oh, wait, you're starting with bad information, and then you're basing all your other theories off this bad information. So I didn't know until recently that history was so murky. Like the stuff that happened in the Dark Ages, the reason that they called it the Dark Ages is because there's really no history at that time. there's no progression of things. And it wasn't until later that I realized, when I started to try to research things to try kind of prove the positions we're in, I'm just like, wow, it's really weird that people debate when Rome fell. It's really weird that they don't have a definite date when it happened. It's because they make lots of guesses because there really is no history, or there's no really chronology to it. There's stories, there's events that happen, and outside of that, they're not sure.
And I totally agree with you too, because there are probably many well-intentioned, I would say, teachers and professors who maybe genuinely think that they're teaching people the truth. So you don't actually have to deceive everyone. You have like this hierarchy, right? So like people at the top, they're controlling the narrative, and then they feed it down the line to, say, the professor. And it's just like these doctors and stuff. They go to school, they get educated, but what's crazy is the doctors they don't teach them about health. They only teach them about prescription drugs and stuff like that, where they don't get taught anything about like true health. They just are taught how to manage symptoms and not actually address the problem. So that's kind of the same thing, like probably with history. I mean, the doctor thinks that he's doing right, but it's just the system. Like you really don't have to deceive a whole lot of people. You just deceive a few at the top, and maybe they don't even know the full picture, and they're just feeding it down the line. You know what I'm saying? So
Oh,
that's why,
100%.
like, even with, we thought with flat earth, like, well, not like they can't have everyone involved like that. And maybe they're not involved the way that you think they are. It's just they're doing it unintentionally in a sense. But problem is they've been fed, like you said, bad information, and they're building all these other nonsense theories on top of that bad information, and so they don't have a good foundation to sit on, because the water is just so murky. I think it's that way for a reason in
Yeah.
this time.
Yeah, it's kind of like that. I mean, I always use the Matrix analogy, where that you have all these people who are plugged into the Matrix, and they could be agents at any time.
Mm,
But it's like they're not bad actors in themselves. They don't know that they're being used, right?
yeah.
They're plugged in, and they don't know any better. And ultimately, they'll be our enemy because they'll resist. Their programming kicks in, and they can't even help themselves. I think that's the perfect analogy to
It
this thing,
is.
because we even talked about it when we were chatting off air the other day, when we were talking about like people like Candace Owens and Tucker Carlson. That there's too many people, I think, in this community who automatically think these people are direct, minions of Satan.
Hmm.
Like, all of us could have been used by Satan at different times because we didn't know, right? It's like we're not even sure how we're being influenced in order to basically do the work of the enemy. And I think that's how most people probably are, because it's kind of like that. I don't believe that these people are literally going up before, like, you know, the devil and being told what to do, and then going to deceive people, or even going under those 3-letter agencies and literally having their talking points. I guess the point is we really don't know, but I think it's more likely that the devil is sly, and he would be able to manipulate somebody else, and to get somebody to do the things they're already kind of like our natural instinct is to do. Yeah, and we have this herd mentality. And if you're in academia, like, you start questioning like the foundation of what they believe, and it's like you're not going to be there very long.
No.
So they would be like, well, what about this? And they'd be like, well, it'd be better if you just don't talk about this. This is or this is already accepted as fact. So like, don't even worry about that. And I think that's what was interesting, is he was saying like even some of the scientists, like the dendrochronologists and different people who believed in like the stratigraphy and dating, they were using the chronology that they had to date stuff because that's the best information they had. And so then it's kind of like a game of telephone. So you get one thing wrong, and eventually it gets really wrong by the end of it. But yeah, to get back onto to track about some of the more mind blowing revelations I heard in this, and I never heard anyone say this. Ricardo, have you ever heard that? So the Romans, again, so they basically enlisted armies of all different cultures and nations. So obviously, it's kind of like you can't take over the whole world. Like they couldn't have a big enough Italian army to dominate the whole world. So they had to enlist and conscript other soldiers from different nations and nationalities and cultures. So I never heard this. Have you ever heard that? So we know that Titus and Vespasian led the destruction of Israel and Jerusalem.
Mm-hmm.
But I did not know that the army, like the rank and file army they used, was made up of Arabs. Did you know that?
I did not.
This was, I thought, obviously, biblically, this is a mind-blowing revelation to me, because he's saying, like, and again, this is actually not even disputed by historians, because they say you can actually find graves of the different people who died during the first century, or whatever that century that was.
Exactly.
And they were Arabs from different nations. And so he was saying, like, there's a problem, though, that we're told that, like, the living quarters, after they destroyed Jerusalem, no living quarters were built for like hundreds and hundreds of years. And so I think, just based on kind of what I do know about Rome, is that the reason you would go fight for Rome, being a foreigner, is because you would be given citizenship, or you'd be given lands, you'd be given control, you'd be given, obviously, treasure, plunder. So you can imagine it'd be way easier to get people to go fight for you if you say, hey, we want you to go knock down this place, but you guys you'll get the rest of it. You'll get to live there. You'll get over all the plunder that's left. And that's what a lot of people said, is that the reason that there was no one stone left upon another in the temple is because the fire got so hot that the gold melted in between the foundations and everything. They literally pried it all up to get it out.
Mm-hmm.
It sort of makes sense that an army of foreign invaders is the one who was staying there doing all that. Right? And so with that understanding, he's saying, yeah, obviously these Arabs who did that stayed, and they lived at the same time as all the other Romans did. And what blew my mind is when he was saying, like, so Islam is
I know where you're going.
basically contemporary to, like, the early Christians. So like this popped up right away. And what we're told based on the chronology is it didn't pop up until mid-antiquity.
Mm-hmm.
So if Islam, Judaism, and obviously early Christianity was all kind of contemporary of each other, now we start talking about Muhammad in a different light, and he's called the prophet. Yeah. What if Muhammad was the false prophet? I'm just saying, like, it's something worth considering, because it's like, what other prophet is ever spoken about in the way that he is?
Yeah.
And, like, literally, he's speaking in the manner of spirit of Antichrist. Is like that Jesus was not God's son. So, like, that's literally what his Quran says.
Yeah.
I think that's pretty interesting.
Yeah, that is super interesting for sure. And Islam says that Jesus never even died on the cross and stuff like that too. Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, that when I heard you say that, it was, and I even text you right away. I'm like, what? I was like, man, that's really, like, thought provoking, because, a lot of people, like I said, they all want answers. Oh, well, who is the false prophet? Who is the Antichrist? And it's like, well, guys, like, we don't know, but I mean, we have our theories, and honestly, that theory right there, especially if all these cultures were around at the same time, like that really makes my gears turn a lot.
Yeah, what was really interesting too, and I can make a pretty decent biblical case about that. As crazy as that sounds, what I found really interesting is, again, Gunnar Heinsohn is not trying to prove us right. What he believed the start of Islam was literally a sect of Judaism turned to Islam. And it kind of makes sense, because obviously they deny Jesus and they believe he was a prophet, but they believe obviously a lot of things that were wrong about the story. And obviously they're way more works-based salvation. What I found interesting, so if you go over to, let me see, it's over in Galatians chapter 4. And so a lot of people say that the modern Arabs and Islam was an offshoot of Hagar's line, right? From Ishmael, the wild child, and all these rebellious people. But it was obviously created many nations. And I used to say, you know what? That doesn't make sense to me, though, because I'm like, how could anybody, like in this day and age, who's got the receipts to go all the way back to Abraham,
Right.
to Ishmael? I mean, I think that's pretty crazy. But what I found really interesting is what Paul says in Galatians chapter 4, verse 24. It says, which things are an allegory? For these are the two covenants, one from the Mount Sinai, which gendereth to bondage, which is Agar or Hagar. For Agar is Mount Sinai in Arabia, and answereth to Jerusalem, which is now is in bondage with her children. But the Jerusalem which is above is free, for it is written, for which is the mother of all of us. And so what he's basically saying is like the Jerusalem that is obviously in rebellion, who does not believe in the promise,
The physical Jerusalem he's talking about.
is the physical Jerusalem, and they are in bondage. And so obviously he's like, it's Paul himself at the time, he's comparing them to Ishmael's line, because that's the mother of Ishmael. So you really think about it, like, so it actually makes sense that they are the ones who are the sect of Islam eventually. Because especially when you have, like, literally you have the Arabs move into that area. Even I saw something recently, somebody sent me an article, that the Saudi princes claim to be original Jews. Again, it's I mean, like I said, it's the truth. Truth is stranger than fiction. But it kind of makes sense that, like, this is how they've continued on. Because haven't people always wondered, like, I'm one of those people who always ask these questions, like, so how do modern Torah keepers do whatever they're doing, right? Because we know there's not a temple there. We know that there's lots of things that are physically not there, that you could not keep up with this old covenant, because you can't. So it changed form. So you have one sect of it who literally went into a whole different offshoot, and they claim to serve the same God as us, but that's Islam. And then you have the Kabbalistic side. But there's nothing in the middle of that, really, because otherwise it's just like you can't just continue on with the old covenant based on the current conditions. So you have Kabbalistic Jews, and then you have Islam. And wouldn't you know that, again, they have the Abrahamic faith house, and it's kind of like we're all children of Abraham, even though the Bible says the only children of Abraham who are now are the ones who believe in the promise of Abraham, and those who believe. And it's not by blood, it's not by lineage, it's by the blood of Jesus.
If I'm not mistaken, too, isn't there a verse, like, I know you're talking about the false prophet, but that the Antichrist himself, like, he would also come from that same lineage as well. And I can't think about the verse off top hand, but
I think I know what you're talking about. So in the book of Daniel, it's basically saying, like, that he's going to have a religion not like his fathers did.
Yeah, he will not honor the God of his fathers.
Yeah.
And so like, you know, a lot of people, you know, even me, I'm like, well, Abraham was the father of both of them. You know what I mean? And so I mean, that could also be another thing, like what you're saying about like biblical proof that these two are intertwined in a way that's, it's just weird, you know what I mean? But they are connected because they both came from Abraham, and you got that inward fighting within them. And, you know, I think that's an amazing theory that, you know, Muhammad could possibly be the false prophet.
It's really interesting. You know, it's funny, even when I was reading, so on Christmas Day, I was deciding to read the Nativity story. Even again, if we don't believe Jesus was born on December 25th, I was still deciding it was good to read it that day. And I was reading about Herod, and I was like, so I went to ChatGPT, and I was like, was Herod even Jewish? And I found really interesting that it said he was not. He was not ethnically Jewish, but he actually practices the religion of Judaism. And of course, I asked ChatGPT, and I said, what do you mean ethnically Jewish? I said, because we already know that, based on what the Bible says, is that the children of Jacob immediately started intermarrying with different nations. Like, obviously, the story of Joseph tells you right away that they were part Egyptian because his wife was Egyptian. And so his sons obviously were half. And then there's the story of, obviously, of Rahab and all the things where it was always a mixing of ethnicities. And so eventually ChatGPT agreed with me, saying, Yeah, he really wasn't. But I thought it was interesting. What they claimed about Herod was that he was related to the Edomites, Esau's
Mm,
line. And I was like, whoa. So like, I guess the thing is like that when you look up the genealogies as best as we have them, it's hard to know what's true. But I mean, at the end of the day, we're left with this belief in God's promises. Then you have people who reject it. Well, that obviously that's who they are. It's not who you're related to. So like obviously if you believe this certain way, then that's who you are. And obviously if you believe like we do, we're brothers and sisters in Christ.
right.
It obviously makes sense that it's like you'll know people by their fruits, not by their genealogies, right? And even I believe that's what Paul's saying, like that do not get into these pointless, fruitless debates about genealogies and all that kind of stuff.
Exactly.
He's talking about like as John the Baptist said to start off the story of the greatest story ever told, he said, do not claim to be children of Abraham because God can raise up children of Abraham through
Through
these
these
rocks
stones. Yep.
if he wants to.
Yeah.
So that's not going to save you. And I think ultimately, I think that's this story. But yeah, I mean, it's wild. It's like I said, it makes all this stuff starts to make more sense with this understanding.
Yeah, and you know what gets me too is I know that Gunnar was talking about this too, and he's not a Christian, but he is speaking of these events, and he's actually like, well, it says in the book of Revelation that this is going to happen, and he's just saying like, yeah, just that's what it said, that's what happened, and he's not even necessarily a Bible believer. But what gets me is that Christians today is that they can honestly think in their heart and mind that none of it has happened. Like you won't admit that at least some of it has come to pass, but no, it's just like no, it's none. And that is the bridge that is hard to gap with these people, because we're saying, well, what if, maybe not all of it, but what about this? I mean, these churches aren't there anymore that they're talking about.
Mm.
Like, but nowadays these pastors are like, yeah, America's the Church of Laodicea, and it's like, no. And I know that you've said it before too, and it's a perfect analogy or way to look at it. But like the Bible was written to us, but not necessarily for us, or it was for us, not to us. You said.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So obviously, there's principles in there that are great for any generation. If you want to learn how to have a good marriage,
Mm-hmm.
listen to what the Lord said about it. You want to raise good children, do that. Love your neighbor, don't lie to people. Like we were saying, I mean, there's good principles in there, and obviously, just the fact that what he did for us, he died for us, he gave us a chance to bridge that gap between us and him. You know what I'm saying? But it's just strange that these people like really believe that none of it has happened whatsoever.
Yeah, I would say that, as I said, I don't ascribe everyone ill motives for this timeline shenanigans. But
Right.
what I probably will say is that obviously some people do know this, and I think that people, if they were being honest, who do know some of the details about the first millennia or whatever the collapse was, they don't acknowledge that it was a worldwide collapse. And so I think that that's why that certain people could never believe that the book of Revelation had happened at any point, because history does not acknowledge this time of when everyone forgot all the things, and why there's certain knowledge of the Romans and things they did. We don't really know how they did things. If there was this unbroken timeline of history, then again, that does not compute. But people are not told about this collapse and the level of this collapse. I mean, Gunnar Heinsohn concluded that up to 90% of the world's population could have died during this time. Now, that is ridiculous. And to think about that, if you like, let's just say I could prove to their normal American church going people that happened. I would have to ask them, okay, so if that was not the book of Revelation, don't you think it's a little weird the Bible does not mention this time that's that chaotic? that transformative to this place we live. Because again, like that if God, the spirit of Jesus, the Holy Spirit is the spirit of prophecy. Like they're not going to prophesy about that going to happen. Like it's kind of like, oh yeah, by the way, before the book of Revelation happens, this other thing's going to happen that's literally going to upend everything in the world. Like that, I think that, again, I don't believe that God didn't forewarn the people. I believe that he did, and I believe that that's, to me, that's the best evidence that it did happen. Because I said, to me, when I first started to research like the mud flood, it's a little concerning that there could be this advanced civilization in our recent past and this world changing cataclysm that the Bible does not talk about.
Or does it?
Or does it? Or does it? And I think what's really wild. So my conclusion, based on learning some of this stuff and obviously moving some of these things closer to our timeline, a lot of us had wondered maybe the mud flood was right around 1776. Maybe that's when Satan was released, and maybe when he was released, this is when all this stuff happened. Well, I don't rule out that there could have been other kind of transformative sedimentary events where like floods and bad things happen. I mean, obviously, again, this stuff happens even now.
Because Sodom and Gomorrah, the
Right.
Lord rained down fire and brimstone. That was just a kind of localized event. I mean, obviously things have happened like that before, but not like what we're saying.
Yeah,
well, everywhere.
So I would say, like, obviously regional floods can happen and they can change topographies clearly, even still today. But to me, I was always a little uneasy by saying that Satan caused all this when he was released. What basically, obviously, what Gunnar's conclusion was, and what he was saying, the conclusion of the people was that they did believe this was Armageddon that had happened. And so there's a channel on YouTube called The Mud Flood Was Armageddon. And I was like, you know what? I didn't really believe that before, but I'm starting to come to the conclusion like that's what it was, because again, most the things that are buried are the Roman things completely. So you think about it, that is literally what the prophecies in Daniel say, is that there's this fourth empire. And during this time of the empire, that God's kingdom, the kingdom that's going to be forever, is established during this time, and it destroys all the other empires. You even think about, like, obviously in Psalm 2, it says that the prophecy about Jesus is that he's given an iron rod and he's going to smash the nations like pottery, and they're going to be fragmented. And so after this time, that there was obviously one worldwide empire on top of another one. Obviously, they're all overlapping each other. And then since then, obviously, all of the nations were split up. And who was given control of the nations? Jesus was. So he had control over all the nations. And so that's what you have, obviously, in our very recent past, that Christendom dominated the whole world. I can't for sure say what physically manifested as far as the millennial kingdom with this view. I'm still kind of working that out in my head. But I would say spiritually, the world was dominated by Christendom. People acknowledged that Christ was king. They actually dated everything Anno Domini. Well, but to hold on that point for 1 second, actually, I wanted to bring this up, was that Anno Domini, I think, is weird, right? I think it's weird because BC is before Christ, and then AD is in Latin.
Yeah.
Isn't that a little weird? Like, why is one of them? Somebody in the comments mentioned, what if AD was after destruction? And I was like, oh. I mean, so you could still acknowledge that Christ is king, and everyone does. But that is kind of makes sense that like BC wouldn't be also Latin, just the AD part. I don't know. I just think it's interesting because I think that, again, like that the kingdom ultimately is upon us when people are indwelling the Holy Spirit, right? Because that's how you can cast out demons by the finger of God. And that's what Jesus was saying. Like, you'll know the kingdom is at hand when you can cast out demons by the finger of God. And so when Jesus was there was obviously a shift, and he was taking the kingdom by force, which is what he's saying. And obviously, I believe that happened.
So I wanted to kind of touch on two things, because you had brought up about So this Gunnar guy, he had said that he thought that this cataclysm had taken out possibly like 90% of the entire population. And if you guys remember in Matthew 24, it says that unless those days were shortened, there shall no flesh be saved. So what does that mean? It means that if God didn't intervene basically throughout all that time and destruction, like nothing would have been saved, but for the elect's sake, he did save a few. And so it does say that this event was going to be that way. Like there's not going to be a lot of people living after this time happens.
Yeah, that's a good
And
call.
yeah, and then you had talked about, which I think you were brought up, you were thinking about the verse in Isaiah where it says, "For unto us a child is born, unto us a son is given, and the government shall be upon his shoulder, and his name shall be called Wonderful, Counselor, the Mighty God, the Everlasting Father, the Prince of Peace." And when you were talking there, it's just like I was thinking about a lot of stuff because, when the disciples were talking to Jesus and he was telling them exactly who he was, what was their response? They thought that he was going to immediately
Mm-hmm.
set up that kingdom. So they're like, they knew the scriptures. They knew, okay, he's coming and he's going to set it up. But they didn't know that he came at that point in time to do what he had to do in order to redeem them.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just the disciples knew at the time too, and so he's like, no, but I'm gonna come back, it's gonna be soon. But like even they knew what was supposed to happen, it just wasn't as immediate as they thought it was going to be. It was just 40 years later, a generation.
It was not in the way that they understood it. I think
Yeah.
again, like actually you can even see at the very beginning of the book of Acts, is right before Jesus ascends, they said, "So when is Israel going to be restored?" And
Mm-hmm.
he doesn't tell them. He's like, "It's not up to you to know that." And so like they probably started to understand, obviously after Pentecost, when they really started getting filled up with the Holy Spirit, and they started to understand like what he was really trying to do. And again, I always have to bring this up to people because again, like you have people like Greg Locke saying, "Oh, well, all of Israel is going to be saved." And it's like you go into Romans 9, he says, all that descended from Israel is not Israel, like true Israel. Like it's like, again,
Right.
once again, always comes back to the belief in the promise. So I believe that, yeah, that people have always kind of missed this stuff. And that's, again, that's how they miss Jesus. And I think, again, it's really kind of heartbreaking to think that that's how people still kind of miss Jesus, is because they think, oh, well, when Jesus comes back like this, then people will be able to accept him. When you're like, but you can accept him now, right? Like obviously we all acknowledge that he's who he said he was, and he died
Yeah.
as he came to redeem us, and he's sitting on the right hand of the Father right now with rule of all the nations, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because it's funny, like even like pre-trib people say that's true, but again, it's like, but it's still, they're still not quite understanding that like this is really the only way this kingdom is eternal. It's something deeper than this flesh and just like actual
Yeah.
kingdoms and buildings and things like that. There's a higher level to this. But yeah, like Gunnar, it's really fascinating to me that again he's not a Christian and he's acknowledging these things happen. And I thought a couple of other really cool points he brought up about Paul was that, so Paul or Saul of Tarsus, he, based on what the Bible says in the book of Acts, he went to different parts of Europe proclaiming the gospel, planting churches. And he's saying some historians would say that Paul never existed because there's not the contemporary accounts like in the first century of him going places and then other places in Europe writing about him. Which again, that's kind of an issue because I mean, you really think about it, like if he planted all these churches, obviously people would have talked about Paul, right?
Right.
Well, what's really interesting is he was saying that people did talk about Paul, and I think he called them the Paulician or the Paulinists, but they were known to be in the times of late antiquity,
Mm-hmm.
like 8th and 9th century times. And I'm like, okay, so that is really wild. So like, yeah, so then you think again, so that would put him when Gunnar says that all this stuff happened. So when they were planning churches, they were actually building churches, and they were building them in the same style of churches that they built of all the other things they built on the same strata level. So yeah, they actually built buildings, and they had church buildings. A lot of people say that the early Christians had home churches. Well, it does say they met like that in the book of Acts. But again, we're talking about the very beginning. We're talking about like literally the first days of Christianity was after Jesus ascended. The apostles are going around Jerusalem and doing things. Of course, they met in churches. I mean, of course, they met in homes at certain points. But obviously, at some point, Christianity got a real big foothold, and they probably needed bigger places to have people to gather together. So what did they do? They built buildings. And there's evidence of the churches. And so what was even fascinating was he was saying the first churches were supposedly built in the third or fourth century, and they were built in a Renaissance style of the first century. But then he says that there's also a second level of, I guess, where the churches were built in the late antiquity, and those were also built in a Renaissance style of the first century. So all the churches from basically from the very beginning to the very end of that millennia, they were all built in the same style at the same strata level. And obviously his conclusion was, just as yours and mine, I think at this point, is it's because they were all built around the same time.
It's exactly what I think is the most logical thing to conclude. And I was thinking of some other verses too, when you were speaking about how, Jesus was speaking to his disciples about, and I know a lot of people have mentioned these verses about how he's saying that there be some standing here among you which shall not taste of death till they see the return of the Son of Man, right? He told that to also Caiaphas. So he told Caiaphas that too. But I was thinking about this just like a couple of days ago, and he also told Peter this specifically as well, or at least hinted towards it when at the end of the book of John. So I'll just read it real quick. It's John 21:18. And this is, he's talking to Peter. He says, "Verily, verily, I say unto thee, when thou wast young, thou girdest thyself and walkest whither thou wouldest. But when thou shalt be old, thou shalt stretch forth thy hands, and another shall gird thee and carry thee whither thou wouldest not." So he's like, they're gonna take you somewhere where you don't want to be, and like basically speaking of his death. And that's what the next verse says: "This spake he, signifying by what death he should glorify God." And if history tells us right, which we don't know, Peter was actually crucified upside down or something like that. I mean, we don't know that for sure, but it does say that they're going to stretch forth his hands, and take him where he doesn't want to go. And when he had spoken this, he saith unto him, "Follow me." So get this. Then Peter, turning about, seeth the disciple whom Jesus loved following, which we know is John, which also leaned on his breast at supper, and said, "Lord, which is he that betrayeth thee?" Peter, seeing him, saith to Jesus, "Lord, and what shall this man do?" So he's like, okay, so you're telling me about what's going to happen to me. What's going to happen to him? And Jesus saith unto him, "If I will that he tarry till I come, what is that to thee? Follow thou me." So it's just like, he's like, well, what is it to you? Even if I come back and he's still alive, what is that to you, Peter? Just do what I told you to do. But that's kind of, I thought anyway, is another way of him kind of signifying that it's a possibility that these people, even John, could still be alive by the time he comes back.
Yeah, most definitely. It all works together with, was it Matthew 16:28 when he says that some standing here won't taste death until you see the Son of Man coming into his kingdom?
Right.
So obviously based on that, when he told the disciples that, and then you have the conclusion in the book of John when he says that, Peter obviously would have believed that John is going to be alive when he comes back, and I'm not going to be. And it fits perfectly, because obviously some of you are going to be alive, which implies that some of you are not going to be alive. And so I think it's interesting that we have the stories about that all the apostles were martyred, save John. We don't really know that. I mean, I think that they say, because sometimes it's really vague what happens to certain apostles, and it's kind of weird how you don't hear about certain apostles. Like, obviously, it's like the Bible just goes dark at some point. And I think, again, it actually makes sense that maybe all the tribulation stuff were playing out, and they didn't have a time to write about all the other things that happened, because they just happened. Like literally the book of Revelation concludes. And that's as much as we know about the story, but we don't know really all the histories of the apostles from the other apostles or people close to them like Luke. Yeah, I think it's safe to conclude that they believed that Jesus was coming back soon. And all the indications based on the way the book of Revelation's written, like that the time is at hand, the things that are going to soon take place, do not seal up this book, for the time is near, it's short. All these things, Jesus says, I'm coming soon. Yeah, they believed it. And again, like it's really wild to think. And again, I wish we could somehow prove this, or at least maybe again, like that's this. Even as much as we've got with this, it's still hard to say exactly when this apocalypse happened. But what I find really interesting, and this is something I've picked up recently, is that so in the 536 video we did, the historians conclude that it must have been volcanoes that caused the darkness. Like that maybe these powerful volcanoes went off, and then that's what, obviously blotted out the sun for a time, obviously atmospheric things and ash and everything in the atmosphere. But again, the history does not say anything about volcanoes. Like historians, like I guess, was it Eusebius or I forget all the exact. Actually, one of the interesting
too many names.
Yeah, one of the actually was really funny. I remember talking about this in the podcast. Was that one of the historians that's quoted about the darkness? His name was John from Ephesus, and I just thought that's really weird. I mean, like obviously, the Apostle John. I don't know if he was from Ephesus, but obviously, he wrote to the Ephesians in the book of Revelation. But John from Ephesus, interesting. Well, that being said, is what was written about to the first century church, or what these historians wrote about 536 is that there was just details about how they couldn't see, and but they really didn't say what caused this. Okay, but potentially a volcano, and I'm not sure if that's true or not. I mean, again, like God could use natural means to cause judgment if he wanted to. So I'm open to that idea. What I find really interesting, and I didn't know this until recently, is that do you know what the first volcanic eruption on the historical record was?
Yeah, we were talking about this a while back, but didn't you say was it? I don't know. I don't want to guess.
It's Mount Vesuvius.
Okay,
and so
yeah.
Mount Vesuvius is where the city of Pompeii was. And so that was literally in 79 AD is what the mainstream history says. And so Pompeii was this Roman city, and it was a very corrupt Roman city, like in the Sodom and Gomorrah type. Like I guess they say based on some of like the evidence they have, find archaeological record, they have like weird, wicked looking paintings and statues and stuff. How wild is that to really think about it? So what if like it was a volcano that happened in 536, and that could have been Mount Vesuvius that started this stuff off? Like again, 79 AD, 70 AD with the destruction of Jerusalem, like you're really talking about, like now you're really talking about, it's still kind of in that window of like this generation when Jesus is talking about this stuff, like that it's you go right from the destruction of Jerusalem eventually to the destruction of the Roman Empire. I think that is like, yeah, does that, I mean, again, they don't really, we're told volcanoes are a certain kind of thing, and they seem to be very common, and yet nobody wrote about them before this corrupt Roman city was destroyed by one after the Romans destroyed Jerusalem.
Yeah. Can you go into that a little bit more? I know that we talked about this a little bit over the phone, and it's like my mind was just into jello when you were just saying about the volcanoes and stuff. I'm like, well, those erupt all the time, don't they? And you were just saying,
oh
like,
yeah,
well, not,
yeah. I saw Ceiling Fan Man in the chat, and if you guys, he did a video. He had a guy on. I think he actually worked for the tourism business in Hawaii, and so basically what the video was about was that volcanoes as were presented are not really real. And so that's not to say that lava is not real, but obviously if you think about like the the diagram is what the science shows you at Earth. You have the mantle, the magma, and you have this core, and so then you have volcanoes that come from that. So what it was basically saying is like that, but when you see like depictions of volcanoes, it's like you have this cone-shaped mountain and then you have lava spewing out them.
Right.
Well, when you go to Hawaii, this is what this guy on, and I forget the guy's name on Ceiling Fan Man's stream, he was saying like that he asked, take me, because I guess they did these helicopter tours to see the volcanoes. And he said, take me to the cone-shaped one, like the one in the postcard. And they laughed at him. He said, they're not like that. So there's lava tubes, and it's almost like the lava is actually, it's a safe natural process. Obviously it's hot and it is molten rock, but it's not like it doesn't, there's really no evidence that these things spew out like what we envision Pompeii to be. Actually, there's the most famous, I think, volcanic eruption, at least in our lifetimes, was Mount St. Helens. And when Mount St. Helens erupted, it wasn't like molten rock went everywhere. It was like literally a mountain, like basically exploded.
Yeah.
Like just like whatever the mountain was, and it just looked nothing like it. So obviously there's some kind of pressurized gas and things like that, and you can have an explosive eruption, but it's not presented in the same kind of way. So
it's not like the science project you did in the 3rd grade.
No, it's absolutely not like that. So the point is like that. I don't know, and I'm like I said, obviously we're in the speculation area where we're talking right now. Is that like that could things like the eruption of Pompeii, could that actually have just literally been like God raining down fire, and then it's scientifically explained by this natural thing that's really not natural as far as we can observe. But it's like the evidence is that these people were charred and things were melted. But we really don't know how it happened. Like I said, that's the funny thing is like that, going back to the 536 video about saying like they believed it could have been the eruption of Krakatoa. It could have been the eruption of like volcanoes in like the northern hemisphere. There could be stuff in North America all erupting at the same time. But again, nobody wrote about volcanoes. So like that's not history. That's not fact. That's speculation by pseudoscientists. Maybe they're real scientists, but the point is like that it's not fact. Even so, they actually, in one of the videos we talked about, there was this account in Polynesia about Krakatoa potentially going off, but they didn't write about a volcano. What they literally wrote about was this storm, and they woke up the next day and they heard like the loudest thing you could imagine, and literally this island of Sumatra was formed. Like basically 2 islands broke apart, and we're like, again, this sounds like acts of God. And this sounds like potentially the day of the Lord, where the mountains melt like wax, the islands are moved out of their places, nothing's left the same. There was a cataclysm, and this happened. And then again, like there's a world with amnesia, as like Graham Hancock always talks about, like the antediluvian world with amnesia. The crazy part is like that I agree with him. There's a world with amnesia, but it's way more recent. It's, that I could believe that they forgot the times before the days of Noah, but actually they probably had a better account of the days of Noah because Noah survived the flood and his son survived the flood. So those stories would have been passed down, and there would have been a better account of history than them. But after that, we really can't say, right? Because we don't know, because we don't have a Noah to rely on. We don't know which godly men survived whatever this was, and we can say, oh, well, don't worry, we can trust him, because we don't have a Noah of our generation, right?
No, we don't. And another thing that you had brought up in that video with the discussion on this Gunnar Heinsohn video was just the fact, I think you had even brought up the Book of Eli, if anyone has seen that. So like basically something cataclysmic happened in the Book of Eli. They were just basically after some sort of destruction event where there was basically zero technology, and it was like the wild, wild west, something like that. happened there, and it's like everything got erased of their past, and they're just like there, you know. And then you had brought up like, how is it that you got these cannibalistic tribes alongside with these other people who are more like what we would call like sophisticated, and
Mm-hmm.
what, like, how is it that these two are like growing up next to each other? And it just might be because of this very fact. They're just existing after this event, and they're just managing with the best way that they can, I guess.
Yeah, it's crazy to think like that those like movies like the Book of Eli, which again I kind of clowned on because I thought that just some of the twists and stuff were not good. But I do think it's a really interesting concept that there was this Bible,
Mm-hmm.
and this Bible was like the most valuable thing in this world. And obviously they don't really give you like the real importance of the Bible, and I think that's why I clowned on the movie, because I was saying like I think a really epic movie would be that you have one faction who wants to use the Bible to free people in a wicked time, right? And then you have one person who's wicked who wants to use the Bible as a means to control people.
Right.
Because I do believe the Bible can be used for both things. For people who obviously, again, like you think about if you didn't know what it said and somebody's saying, this is God's word and it tells you got to listen to me. It says, do not question God's anointed one, right? Like, and they could twist scriptures. Obviously that happens today. But I think it's really fascinating to think like that potentially that is a depiction of what was after that time in late antiquity when there was this collapse. And it does seem like that these people really relied on the Bible to try to date things the best they could. So there was an attempt on probably both sides where you have like certain people probably using the Bible in the right way to inform people about what happened. And then you have these wicked people who are still trying to use the Bible to say, no, I don't want everyone to know what it says. I'll tell you
Mm-hmm.
what it says. And then you could have these wicked denominations of churches trying to control people like that. You
Yeah.
know what I'm saying? Like, so like that starts to seem like really real to me.
It does, because it's just like that guy went through great lengths in order to obtain this book that may or may not still be in existence. And they're basically looting people. And I know that we have kind of talked about this in the past about movies, is just there's a lot of truth in these movies which people pass off as entertainment only. And so it's like the news media is practically fake, and that's the entertainment. And then the movies, they're actually telling you the real truth in certain things, and you think it's fantasy. And I think they've done that on purpose.
Oh, most definitely. Yeah, most definitely. That yeah, it's really interesting to think. And like I remember in the Book of Eli as well that s- some people were saying like that. Why would you even want that book? This is what caused this apocalypse. Like I said, really think about it like in that
Yeah,
kind
I'm
of
gonna have
way
to
where
watch
like,
that again.
yeah, well, I mean, there's probably is clues to like what they're
Yeah.
talking about is that there's this post-apocalyptic landscape people are walking across, and some people are actually blaming this book for what
Mm,
happened. And obviously, like however they present it in the movie, obviously, is not how it happened in real life.
right.
But you could imagine that there's a reason why there was few Bibles left at that time, or like only one, is because that people burned the books. They didn't want people to know what it said.
Yeah.
And so, like, again, like the people who were trying to control it, it's like that. Obviously, we have the stories of like the Reformation and things like that. Like obviously people can, question how much of the story is accurate. But what we're told is that people tried to print the Bible in the common language.
Hmm.
And those people were literally, they're the ones who were burned when they
Yeah.
did that. I
Yeah.
believe that. I mean, I believe it. I believe it because they are trying to control people and they're trying to control the narrative. And it is fascinating to think that like, yes, movies like again, like we talk about the show, like what's it?
Fallout.
Yeah, Fallout. Of course, it's like you're. All we know is there's these factions of people, and certain people are looking for relics of the time before. Then obviously, then there's people that are caught in the middle, like literally, there are people who are in the dark under the ground who don't know what happened. Then there's people who were born after this whatever happened, and they're told this history of whatever happened.
Hmm.
It really is like amazing to think like that. Obviously, all this culture, all like the great storytelling obviously comes from true stories. And I think,
Yeah.
again, I think that's why some of this stuff really resonates with us. We're like, dang, I bet you we could be deceived in that kind of way. And yeah, to go all the way back to Revelation chapter 20, really think about this as we presented this case. Tell me you couldn't be deceived if you lived in the times of the book of Eli. And then you can imagine generations after that, like 100, like 100 generations after that. What would the people really know? Or not the 100 generations, but like 20 generations after that. Like what would you know? Because it's like you're being told part of the story, and some people are not even necessarily lying to you, but they don't know the whole story. And then like how did we get here? And like
Yeah.
what's happening? And then obviously then you can imagine people in 2024, 2025 now reading the Bible saying, I wonder when this stuff's going to happen. Right?
Yeah.
Right? Like it's
Yeah.
like literally we're like reading a book that's addressed to people, like real people of our past. And then people today are saying, I wonder when this is going to happen. Like we're living, let's just say, I would say we're living at least 1,000 years after those people have all been long dead.
Right.
And then people are saying, I wonder when this is going to happen. They believe the book, but they really don't, because they have no understanding of it.
Yeah. I was thinking about it too. It's just an interesting concept as well, even in these movies, like that they even have this concept of a time where like the earth as they knew it was just basically completely destroyed, and they're living after that. Like, where did they get that concept from anyway, if it wasn't from either the book of Revelation, or maybe they know, or maybe their ancestors, maybe they know that they're living in this time, and that they're post-apocalyptic, and they're just giving us little tidbits of that. But I just think it's interesting that they have that concept even in the movies, and we just think, oh yeah, whatever. But I was going to ask you too, have you ever seen the movie Fahrenheit 451?
I have not.
Yeah, so that's another good one, and that one is with Michael B. Jordan. And in that movie, it's kind of the same concept as like burning books and not letting people know their true history and stuff like that. So in this movie, he's a fireman, but the firemen actually, they go and they burn books. That's what they do.
They're the ones
And
that start the fires, huh?
yeah, they're the ones that start the fires. And the people who actually know the truth, they like have to hide out in these like little underground things, and they're trying to still pass along information. But once a fireman come in, they burn all the footage, they burn all the books. That way people don't know anything about their real history. And it's funny because even in that movie, someone was talking about, I think they said Thomas Benjamin Franklin. They said, oh, he was Benjamin Franklin was the first fireman or something, and they're like saying that, and they like truly believe it. You know what I mean? And it's just like things like that where like today we can be told something like that, and we accept it at face value, and we don't really know other than that, if that makes sense.
Oh, no question. Actually, what's interesting that kind of fits right in is that, so another founding father, Thomas Jefferson, we
Yeah.
talked a little about him on the last mixtape we did. And so what I can't believe, and obviously, again, I'm from Virginia, so obviously Thomas Jefferson gets talked about a lot. So if you think about, like, a lot of people believe that the little season could have started in 1776, around that time frame.
Mm-hmm.
What's really interesting is obviously the guy who wrote the Declaration of Independence in 1776, Thomas Jefferson, he also printed his own Bible. Have you ever heard that?
Yeah, the Jefferson Bible.
Yeah, and he took out all the miracles, and he took out the book of Revelation out of it.
Mm-hmm.
And so kind of like what you're saying is like you have this kind of book burner. It's like obviously one way to not even necessarily burn a book would be like to rewrite it and leave in the parts you want, take out the parts obviously they're unproductive for you. But it also does make sense that if the little season starts and like they're really trying really hard automatically just to go right to that in that way of literally saying
It
that,
never happened.
yeah, that never happened. You
Yeah.
know, yeah, I think it's really interesting. But just as before we wrap up, I thought a couple of things. First of all, you guys probably, if you guys are confused at all about what we're talking about, I know we kind of got, like, Ricardo and I have already learned some of this stuff, so it's kind of like, if you want to kind of catch up about what we were talking about, again, check out the streams Paul and I did. Obviously, I got the breakdown of like the 3 different parts of the presentation by Gunnar Heinsohn. But a couple really interesting things based on what his research said. I thought one of the more fascinating parts was when he was talking about the Vikings. So he
Yeah.
was saying, like, the Vikings, based on how the history is taught, is like they forgot how to sail for a certain amount of time, like a 700-year period. And so, but when they did learn how to sail, they developed the square sail. I cannot believe when he showed the coins and he showed the Viking ships compared to the Roman ships, and they were like exactly the same. Okay,
Interesting.
so based on this research, that would put the Vikings contemporary with the Romans, right? Like the first century Romans. They have the same boats. And again, it's on the coins. So don't tell me that, again, these are traded around the whole empire. Don't tell me that the Vikings didn't know how, they never saw the coins, and they wouldn't have made 2 and 2 together being a seafaring people. Okay, so the connection that I made, obviously, it's a shame that he's no longer with us, because I love to ask him this question. Because what we're told is that 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. Well, right, whatever, dates aside. Then very recently, even when I was going to school, a lot of, with a wink and a nod, people said a lot of people believe the Vikings made it to North America before Columbus did. And now it's widely accepted by historians that Leif Erikson got to the New World 500 years before Columbus did. Okay, so obviously in my mind, I was like, okay, so but if you take 14, well, let's just take the chronology, and we're just going to take 700 years away. So 700 years away plus 500 years before Columbus. Now you're talking about literally in the heyday of Rome. Like, so during the Roman Empire, the Vikings got to North America. And again, if the Rome dominated the whole world, that would obviously put the Vikings under the control of the Romans, and them having the same boats, it was likely that they were Roman ships because the Vikings were under Roman control. So if they got to the New World during Roman times, and if they did anything here, what would it have looked like? So if they had the same kind of architecture, art, culture, and all this kind of stuff, what if they did something while they were here? And so that was the thing I laughed about the Columbus story, was that, so people accept now that the Vikings likely got to North America before the Columbus did. But what did they do? Well, history says they didn't do anything. Really? What if they built things? What would it look like? Would it be in a Greco-Roman style? Could this literally be where some of these crazy buildings come from that really don't fit the architecture of, like, yeah, frontiermen and just like the colonial British? I think it makes sense, because now you look at all these mud flooded places around North America, and obviously well beyond North America. Almost all the Greco-Roman stuff is mud flooded. So were those places built at like the same sedimentary layer, the same stratigraphy? Is it possible that that's evidence that the Romans actually did get to North America? I think,
Yeah.
like I said, I think, to me, it's like this is like a hand fitting into a glove. It's like this all makes sense in this thing. And I could be off, and it could be a little bit after that. But I think, to me, it makes sense that if the Vikings had the same boats, they were Roman boats. The Vikings were Romans, right? Because if Paul of Tarsus, a Jew in the line of, in the tribe of Benjamin, was a Roman citizen,
Right.
then it makes sense that also potentially Leif Erikson might have been a Roman too.
Like I said, it's just mind-boggling for me still, even now, to just try to process all this information. So for anyone who is kind of hearing this for the first time, I mean, I understand it's a big pill to swallow for sure. And honestly, when I first came to the conclusion that our timeline was messed up and we might be living in the little season, like it like kind of ruined my life for like a whole month. You know what I'm saying?
Hmm.
Because it's just, we as people, we like to have answers for all these questions, but I mean, we're trying to figure it all out right now, but honestly, I would say just keep reading, keep digging into this information because it is deep. It's very, very deep. And I've said before that, in my opinion, I think we talked about this in our last podcast about the alien deception, that this deception here is probably the bottom of the rabbit hole for every single other conspiracy, in my opinion. Like, you want to know why for everything else, like why this, why that, even like, well, why would they tell you that you live on a spinning globe? It's like, well, because we're in Satan's little season, you know?
Hmm.
So because they're trying to deceive us that we're going to have an alien deception, because maybe, when New Jerusalem comes out, they might think, oh, well, this is a mothership, and I know we've exhausted that, but I mean, it's become quite obvious to me.
Yeah, no, I think it's 100%. I mean, that's where all the lies ultimately are leading is this final deception, whatever this is going to be. And obviously we can speculate about what that is. But I think it's interesting how this potential, destructive event in late antiquity kind of explains a lot of the reasons why they can kind of say, well, there was this time people were really dumb. It's not because they weren't intelligent, it's because literally they were like living in the dark and they had no idea what had happened.
Mm.
What the lie is that there was periods of very advanced people, and so like people literally were relearning things, and people were like reintroducing, they were finding things, they were finding books, they were finding evidence of advanced cultures, and they didn't understand it. So you have two big great resets based on what we know, and again based on like the strata and the sediment. You had the days of Noah, which I believe were advanced, and also you had this time where the Romans ruled the whole world. And then you have a rebuilding based on, even like Gunnar Heinsohn actually says that the society was nursed back to health by monasteries. Think about that whole idea of the meek inheriting the earth. Like that's where it ended up. And so then people could say, oh, people were primitive then, but it's like it's not primitive. It's like literally it is. It's like the Book of Eli, where primitive. Well, people are primitive. It's like that steampunk like idea of like them taking parts of things and creating different things with it because they didn't know. They're just trying to survive. It's like Mad Max. Like that's what you're talking about, where people primitive in the times of Mad Max. Well, I mean, I know it's a movie, but like, what I'm saying? It's like that they had a little bit understanding, but obviously compared to their forefathers, yeah, they were like cavemen. And then you go move forward, and then we can look back about, and as a society, and we could say, look how smart we are, look how dumb they were, without an
Right.
understanding of why they were like they were.
Yeah, and that's a good point that you bring up too, because I know that all of us, we use this technology that we have today, but who truly understands how it works and operates? Like, if it
We
were
don't.
all taken out today, I couldn't. I mean, the only way I'd be able to contact you maybe is if I had your address and a map or something, because
Mm-hmm.
I couldn't use Google Maps or anything, and
Mm-hmm.
I might be able to send you a letter maybe, but I mean, really, I mean, that I think that's where it gets down to the nuts and bolts of things. Like, even us being in this environment that we are, if it was all wiped out, like, we wouldn't know how to bring it back to where it
Yeah.
was. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. If they shut down the
And
internet, people would be really in the dark. I mean, like literally, like there would be, they've trained us basically to stay at home. And if
right.
they cut the internet off, I think people really would be blind. I mean, I think people, obviously that's why people really need to obviously learn and save things like that. Because it's like, yeah, one day, obviously there's lots of hints that they're going to actually do that. Like the
Right.
movies like Leave the World Behind and things like that. It's like, if that ever happened, like an EMP and they knocked out the grid, yeah, people would really be struggling.
Yeah. No, I get it. And so like it's like you said, it's just touching on what you brought up just right before then. It's not that the people were stupid. It's just, it was taken away maybe, and then they don't know how to build it back up. Because honestly, we've talked about this in past podcasts too, is that even like our technology and stuff like that, like how does it even work? You know what I mean? How does a normal person put a little piece of foil on a plastic disc, put it in a player, and it plays a 4K movie? You know what I'm saying? Like, what is that? What is that technology? What is the internet? You know what I'm saying? Like, I don't know how it works. I just push a button and it turns on, and I just connect
Right.
to it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think some people have mentioned it could be Nephilim tech, it could be angel
That's
tech,
what I'm saying. That's what I'm
it
hinting
could
at.
be
Yeah.
obviously tech from like the Watchers and things like that. I mean, I
Yeah.
don't know. You're right. I do think the dangerous part about it is you think about like what we're taught about our, like our forefathers and potentially being very reliant on the rain and God's green earth, and they could do things, they could build things, they were self-sufficient. Well, obviously, over the past bunch of generations, they've taught us to really rely on other people and other means, and we don't know how things work. That's what I mean.
No.
It's kind of like the next apocalypse might not have to come the way that these previous ones came, because literally, if they shut things off, we'd have no idea. We'd be using our old tech as hammers, like
Yeah.
because we don't have certain kinds of tools. You'd be using these different things to use because I don't know how to make any of this electronic stuff that ever went out and stuff. It broke.
And just like, even I would say, like, even cars, like our transportation, we were talking about in the mixtape with horsepower. Why did they even use that term? And it's just like, obviously, I'm sure that we aren't the first civilization that had a motorized vehicle, is what I'm trying to hint at.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And what happened is, maybe this apocalyptic event, and then all they had was animals, and they just kind of did the best they can with what they had.
Yeah, 100%. Definitely.
But yeah, man, do you have anything else that you'd like to touch on in closing?
No, just on close. I want to point out one just kind of factoid that didn't make it into like kind of the general discussion, was really interesting, is that I know that Paul and I on different streams, he talked about Jesus being depicted in like medieval garb at times, and we were just thinking that's a little weird. And so what Gunnar Heinsohn concluded was that the times of Jesus were after the times of like Arthur of Camelot. So King Arthur, like the tales of like the medieval knights and stuff like that. And I thought it was really interesting. And he did a different podcast where he mentioned that, yeah, there's other writings where Merlin, the story of Merlin, who's like a wizard or whatever he was, I guess he was some kind of weird druid, like the real life Merlin. He was contemporary of Julius Caesar. And I thought, that is really fascinating, because again, it's like you're really pushing this history in a more, obviously the timeline as it gets compressed, it's like that is really wild to think that like you have these medieval knight stories, and that's actually before the times of Jesus. I guess it's like when you do this kind of research, and obviously these are his conclusions based on science. It's not often that we get to lean on the science and say, see, this is what it actually says. So I do think that, again, like that some of these ideas we're fleshing out on this podcast are just like, well, if this, what if this? Like this could be like, again, like the stuff about Muhammad. But again, I would always say, I always try to remind people, don't just take my word for it. You guys should watch the original presentation. You can even watch the one without our feedback, Paul and I's feedback in it. Paul has that on his channel. Watch it, and with this mindset of like, this guy is not the last thing this guy was trying to do is prove a couple guys right a few years into the future,
Right.
like us. I feel like that. I don't know. I feel like through God's grace, and I think God's revelations to some of us, was like, it's what blew my mind more than anything was that there could be real evidence for the things we already kind of were saying. They could fit it together in such a way that you can actually point to and you can actually make people understand. Even I was saying that I just did a podcast with my buddy Matt with postmodern theology. I always get his name mixed up. And he was saying that there's actually a 700-year gap in manuscripts, like some ancient manuscripts. And like when he realized that, like as we were doing the podcast, he was like blown away of like it all makes sense. It's like it's the more mind-blowing thing is not what the results, but it was like, oh wow, we might really be right about what we're saying.
Yeah.
Like I was almost like so surprised that we have been on the right track. And I obviously I praise God for this information. I only can imagine what we can learn with this understanding and more research to kind of piggyback off this. I don't know. I'm excited though.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up because that was one of the first things I had mentioned at the beginning of the discussion about, and I said we're not going to name drop, and then we kind of got off into it. But yeah, that when I heard that King Arthur may have been living before Jesus, boom. I mean that's like crazy to even consider, you know what I'm saying? But like in light of all this information that we're finding out, it truly brings me back, and we're praising God for leading us this way. But when he says not ask and it shall be given to you, seek and you shall find, and then you knock and the door shall be open. So it's just like we're seeking this information, and it's just like he's like, all right, come on, buddy, like just kind of pushing us and leading us in this direction. And I'm truly thankful for everyone who has been looking into this far longer than we have. And in the Bible, it says that two are better than one, and a threefold cord is not quickly broken. So it's just we can learn something on our own, and if we got a buddy, we could both learn. But like we got everyone putting their efforts together to try to fit this theory, which what we think has already happened. And I'm just thankful for everyone who before us, and we're obviously taking one in the chin right now too, and everyone calling us heretics, but like truly there's been people like way before us that have been taking the beating for far longer, and I'm just thankful for them that was able to move past that and to still get the research out there despite all the people who are scoffing and mocking them.
Yeah, well, it was funny actually. I was just thinking about that. There's a couple pretty big like YouTube accounts, and just I mean, obviously people who do this kind of like do Christian things on YouTube, like the Good Fight Ministries, and they were kind of pushing back against preterism kind of recently. And I would love it if they could just give me just some time and say, what if I could prove to you? What if I could show you really strong evidence that the Book of Revelation happened? Would that change your mind at all? I feel like that we can actually do that. I could actually present it in a way now where people could really, like, they might not agree, but like I feel like that now I could actually point to some very specific things about like a third of the earth being scorched and having the dark earth and things like that. I welcome an opportunity at this point. And it is interesting that I had a couple of people wanting me to debate the little season. And actually my buddy at Postmodern Theology encouraged me, no, don't do that yet. You're not ready yet. And he wasn't saying that in a way that like you're like you couldn't. He wasn't trying to like say anything ill of me. He was actually saying,
right,
you're pretty good now, but like when you need to have all your T's crossed and I's dotted. And I agreed with him
yeah,
because he's
before
like,
you get thrown in the lion's
well,
den.
because he's like, the last thing you want to do is like to not have an answer for something that you could have an answer for. Like we're still doing a lot of research in this, and it's like to think that I could have went potentially on a show and then without this understanding, like like there's so much more. Like I like because he's like, by the time you're gonna be starting to do this, you're gonna be asked to do it a lot, and then you're gonna continue to do it. And so like I think it's super awesome to think that, man, it's almost like that we had the pieces, but like when you're putting a puzzle together, but now we have the picture. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like the difference between like trying to put these pieces together. Now we actually know what the picture looks like. And now we can kind of put them together and we're like, it's on. It's on.
Yeah, man, that's I think that's a good place to close off there. And we always appreciate you coming on, and you're welcome anytime. Just say when, and we'll get you back on to have a discussion, man. And it's just been a true blessing to get to know you. I know we've kind of been talking over the past couple years and stuff, and so it's been cool for us to just kind of build this friendship and stuff together. So I just appreciate you for taking time out of your day and just coming to hang out, man.
Of course, man. And yeah, dude, anytime, anytime.
Yeah, for sure. And so, like we always tell all our listeners, remember to question the narrative, and God bless.
God bless.